Well, the turkey's been eaten, the sales have been had, and the snow is coming. There's heaps of start sits to talk through in week 13, so let's get into them on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. And we are 4 games in already. Whether you're trailing by a heap because you're facing Brock Bowers or well ahead because you had Janu Smith or Jaden Reed, there's still plenty of games to come, plenty of starts and sits to decide on. And gosh, we had an interesting first 4 games as well. The big one, of course, being the Chiefs getting by again. And look, I'm not that biased. But I will say that in 2010, Peyton Manning with the Broncos had exactly the same experience against Seattle. Early snap, flag, whistle, and they gave up a safety. So this is not an unprecedented situation. So stop arguing about it. Let's move on. We're going to be in the playoffs regardless. Are you going to be in the fantasy playoffs or not, though? That is the real question. If you need help, make sure you leave your questions in the comments below. You can also hit me up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Our rankings are over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. And of course, you can check out my articles over at football.rasball.com. And it would be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube too. But let's get into the starts and sits for this week. And let's start off with the quarterbacks as always. And realistically, you got Hurts, you got Jackson, you got Allen, you are starting them. And if you got 2 of them, probably should trade 1 away. Jaden Daniels has been consistently pretty solid. He gets Tennessee, which isn't a great matchup, but I still think he's going to be okay. Joe Burrow also gets a tough matchup against Pittsburgh. They have conceded the least points to quarterbacks so far this season, but he's Joe Burrow. And I simply think you have to start him over everyone else who is closer to being a streamer at this stage. There's really only 6 consistent, strong starters every single week. Justin Herbert gets a great matchup against Atlanta. The Falcons have conceded the 7th most points to quarterbacks, but less than Carolina has. And therefore, Baker Mayfield's also a valid option. I've got Herbert above Baker simply because of the availability of the receivers at this stage, but I do think there's an argument that Baker probably has slightly higher upside. Herbert having no J.K. Dobbins does mean I think he'll probably pass more. C.J. Stroud gets Jacksonville, which has all season long been the best matchup in football, but they're also a very good running back matchup, and we have seen them lean on Joe Mixon a lot, regardless of the situation. So in this situation where they could go either way, I do think we'll see a lot of use of the running backs around the goal line. That's going to hurt CJ Stroud a lot, but he has plenty of upside against a very weak Jacksonville secondary. And Bo Nix against Cleveland, not the greatest quarterback matchup, but it's solid. They're kind of middle of the field, and Nix has been very consistent, QB7 on the season. So I do think he's a good start this week. Slightly further down, Sam Darnold, very inconsistent, but last couple of weeks has been very good. He gets Arizona. I think that's a solid start. And Anthony Richardson, also very inconsistent. He gets New England. Usually you'd run on New England, but I just don't know that the Patriots fully trust their the Colts fully trust their running game. So I do feel like we're going to see plenty of Richardson, especially around the goal line as well, even though I think it's going to be a step forward for Jonathan Taylor today as well, or tomorrow, I should say, as well. Kyler Murray's a little bit scary in general. Minnesota should be a good matchup, but they have certainly improved against quarterbacks, even though their secondary has struggled. It is really hard to run the ball on the Vikings, so I could imagine a situation where we see a lot less James Conner and Trey Benson and a lot more from Kyler. But it's also possible just in general, as we saw against the Seahawks, that they might just struggle in general. And Matthew Stafford's the last guy that I think you can feel okay about starting. We have seen the Saints giving away a lot more points in the last few weeks, mainly to running backs and wide receivers, but we have seen QBs go okay against them as well. Everyone else below there is a real risk, especially the guys that haven't started already, of course. Now, running back wise, and for me, Joe Mixon is number 1. And I don't take that lightly, but he's got a fantastic matchup. They're using him a lot. I'm certainly trying to take a lot of the load off of CJ Stroud. And that's really the only reason I can move Saquon Barkley down. That and the fact that Barkley is playing against the Ravens, and the Ravens have been one of the tougher running back matchups. We have seen that you can check down to running backs a lot against the Ravens, and I feel like that's how they're going to use Barkley a lot more. We saw them do that with Chase Brown and then with Jalen Warren as well. I would suspect that possibly we see that with Barkley too, where there's a lot less just running into the Ravens front seven, a lot more getting Barkley out in space, letting him make moves out in the open field. Alvin Kamara gets a solid matchup against the Rams. And Christian McCaffrey, I've got him pretty high up, but it's really tough in that Buffalo game because I haven't really mentioned it yet, but it's a snow game. We know there's going to be a massive amount of snow. There already has been a massive amount of snow. And while we expect that snow to ease a little bit during the game, I don't know. I still think there's going to be plenty of snow out on the ground. Typically, that doesn't necessarily mean bad things as long as it's not too cold, and especially if there's not ice. It becomes like slurry, then it becomes really difficult to play in. But if there's not rain and it's not very icy underfoot, then I feel like they might be okay. So for that reason, at this stage, I've got McCaffrey up there. But if it turns into a true like bad snow game, then I'll move McCaffrey down a little bit because his scoring upside will drop, and I'll also just drop off all of the kickers from that matchup because you do not want to be kicking in heavy snow. McCaffrey, though, is still very good floor because they're going to have to run the ball so much. That does drop Purdy off a lot, and Josh Allen will drop even more depending on what we hear about the game. Bijan Robinson, look, it's a fine matchup against the Chargers. Not a great matchup, but it is a situation where I think they'll use him even though it's a tough running game. Jonathan Taylor arguably could even be ahead of Bijan, but I don't trust them to use him effectively in the red zone when they've got Anthony Richardson. Derrick Henry gets that tough matchup against the Eagles, but you still got to start him. He's Derrick Henry. He's always capable of making plays. I think where it gets interesting is at 10, Chase Brown against Pittsburgh. Look, it's not the greatest running matchup, but it's an easier running matchup than it is a passing matchup. And we have seen them lean on Brown in close games. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot of receptions for Brown. We've seen Burrow check down to Brown a lot in the last few weeks. They finally started to trust him in the receiving game. Earlier in the season when they had Zach Moss did anything that might involve pass protection. We have seen them convert those across to Brown. We know he was one of the big improvers in the offseason. That was one thing we talked about a lot in our offseason shows, and that started to come up later in the season. So I do think Brown is a strong start this week. After that, it gets a little bit interesting. Kyren Williams, probably the lowest I've had him so far this season, against New Orleans, who are actually a very easy run defense. They've conceded the 5th most points to running backs, but they're just not using Williams in the passing game. That really lowers his floor. He's guaranteed to have, 70 or 80 rushing yards, and you're hoping for a touchdown, but there's no floor there. In PPR, it's even hardest to start him. We saw that Josh Jacobs and Achane had great games, so I feel justified in putting them ahead already. But can Kyren do better than a Chase Brown, for example? I don't think so. I think he's very much a low-end RB1 at this stage with both Kupp and Nakua back. Chuba Hubbard, obviously the clear starter against Tampa Bay. It's a solid running back matchup, not as good as it is at some places, but they've conceded a top 10 points to every single position. The Tampa defense just concedes a lot of fantasy points in general, mainly because their offense is very good. It's hard to know exactly what the game flow is going to be, but I do think the Tuba's got a good chance of getting a heavy load. We saw how little they used Jonathan Brooks. I do think they ramped Brooks up a little bit this week, but it is still mainly going to be Hubbard. Breece Hall gets that solid matchup against Seattle. He's a little bit banged up. Definitely keep your ear to the ground. I'm expecting him to play, but it is possible he may be limited in some way. And if that happens, he'll drop down. If we hear that he's limited, for example, I'll probably move him down to maybe 20 or so, I think. Or I can't move Dowdle, so I guess 21 potentially, or 18 would be where I move him to. Depends on whether Spears plays as to whether Pollard jumps over him or not. Kenneth Walker gets that Jets matchup. You have traditionally been able to run on the Jets a little bit, but I don't know. Seattle doesn't generally do things that way. I do think Walker will be used in the red zone a fair bit, but he has been a bit disappointing the last few weeks. I do think we'll see some Charbonnet in the passing game as well. So hard to know exactly what to expect from Walker. That's why he's below those guys, but he may jump over Hall. Bucky Irving, I thought he was going to be ranked pretty high this week, but a lot of other guys that I think are solid options, and we are seeing a lot of Rashad White and then Sean Tucker's popping up in the red zone. But I do think that Tampa will run the ball a heap on Carolina. Carolina have conceded the most points to running backs so far this season. And frankly, it's not even particularly close. The second most points has been Jacksonville, and they've conceded over a point more a game than Jacksonville and way more than everyone else as well. So Irving's a strong start. Rashad White is an option. Problem is he's more of a passing down guy, which means he's going to be used more in close games. Is this going to be a close game? maybe. Carolina showed some okay stuff, but I think probably not. So you're really hoping for some red zone looks and a few receptions from White. Aaron Jones, could have him higher against Arizona. You can run on Arizona, but I just feel like there's better options ahead of him. He's still a fine start. Same thing with James Cook, especially in that snow game. Depending on what that game's looking like, I may even move Cook up a little bit, but the snow certainly limits his touchdown upside a little bit. Obviously, we've already seen Montgomery and Dowd will have good games. Tony Pollard, he'll drop a little bit if Spears is playing and healthy. Probably drops below Robinson, but probably not any further. Robinson's a solid option, but we have seen him be limited when injured. He has practiced quite a lot this week, so I think he's probably going to be close to a full go. But keep your ear to the ground with that stuff as well, and hit me up on Sunday morning if you have questions on that. James Conner gets that really tough matchup against the Vikings. They're using Benson a lot more. But what was very interesting in the last 24 hours is that we've heard that James Conner has a 2-year extension. Kind of shocks me a little bit. I know he is one of their best players, but why are you drafting Trey Benson so high if you've got James Conner? Now, maybe they just expected that Conner couldn't stay healthy and he was going to fall off, and he's impressed this year, but I don't think he's been that great this year. I think he's had some struggles. This has certainly been the weakest year we've seen from him. Still a great running back, still their best running back, but I don't know. This feels like it's going to turn more and more into a committee as things go forward. So I feel like this is probably the time you can sell high on James Conner if you're in a dynasty league and your trade window hasn't closed. Same thing with a redraft league, honestly. But I don't see him dropping off as much as I expected because they're still in playoff contention. And because of that, because of the fact he's actually going to be back next year, they're not going to have to transfer across to Benson. Kind of surprised they didn't see what they had with Benson a little bit more. And it is possible that they were just giving Benson a go before deciding to use Conner, and we may actually see less Benson moving forward. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Monday Stevenson gets that good matchup against Indy. How do they use him? Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Indy have conceded the 6th most points to running back, so you'd expect Stevenson to have a good game, but last game they started to use a whole lot more Antonio Gibson. Stevenson ended up with like 8 carries to 13 yards or something terrible. I do think that if Stevenson has a good start, they'll stay with him. It really wasn't until late third quarter we started to see more Gibson, a little bit of Hasty. I think probably Stevenson has the lead role, but that risk there is the reason I've got him a lot lower. If you need upside rather than risk, I do feel like Stevenson has plenty of upside in that game. Already talked about one. We've seen Swift, Najee Harris against Cincy. That's not the greatest situation. Cincy is definitely a team you want to pass on. They've conceded bottom 10 points to running backs and 3rd most points to quarterbacks. So I think that Harris might struggle a little bit, plus Jalen Warren's getting more involved. Same thing with Nick Chubb against Denver. That's just generally a tough matchup. It's tough to score. You can run on them more than you can pass on them, but I do still think Chubb might struggle. He doesn't get involved much in the check down game, so you're hoping for touchdowns. Don't think there's going to be many touchdowns for the Browns in that game. We've already seen Hunt and Pacheco, obviously. Warren, we talked about. Travis Etienne is probably the lead guy, but against the Texans, that's a really tough matchup, and Tank Bigsby is back. I don't love either of those guys, but Etienne's the lead back, so he's higher off the 2 for me. I might even move Bigsby down below Justice Hill at this stage. Gus Edwards against Atlanta is interesting. I think that he's going to be used a lot less than people are hoping for. I think we see a lot of Kamani Vidal and Hassan Haskins. In fact, I think we see very little of the running backs in general, which is going against what I expected earlier in the season, but especially against the Falcons, who have such a weak pass defense and a top 10 run defense. I do think we're not going to see enough out of Edwards, Vidal, and Haskins to make any of them startable. If I have to start someone, and I have to in a couple of leagues, I'll start Gus Edwards, but we're talking like 32-team leagues or really deep dynasty leagues. So for most situations, you just avoid them because they're essentially touchdown and bust. No one else of particular interest there, except Braylon Allen. If Breece Hall can't go, Allen will drop in basically where Hall is. He'll go in nearly that identical spot. Might go below Walker at kind of like running back 15, like this sort of region around Bucky Irving. So definitely, if he's available in your league, you just have to pick him up now that there's a possibility Hall has an injury. Should have had him anyway, realistically. Wide receivers, AJ Brown, number 1 for me. That's going against consensus. Most people have Jamar Chase. We saw what Chase did against Baltimore, but I think that's saying more about the matchup. I think that we'll see Brown be very good this week. It is possible Chase has a good game against the Steelers. We have seen they're weaker against out-wide receivers, but they've still got conceded, the 5th fewest points to wide receivers so far this season. So I do think that Chase is probably going to have a hard game, even though they're the favorites against in a scoring game against the Steelers, according to Vegas odds. Nico Collins moves up a little bit for me against Jacksonville. Excellent wide receiver matchup. I do think we're going to see a lot of Joe Mixon, but if we're going to see anyone else, it's going to be Nico Collins. He's got huge upside. I expect a touchdown as well within the realm of possibility as well. Puka Nacua gets that strong matchup against the injured secondary of the Saints. They do have some guys coming back, but they're still very much affected by injuries on both sides of the ball, really. So I do think that Nakua's got a good chance for a big game. And so does Cooper Kupp, which is why I've got them both up there ahead of Justin Jefferson, who drops to 6. In a slightly tough matchup against Arizona. It is hard to pass on Arizona, especially when you can run on them so effectively. So I do think it's a tough game for him. Mike Evans gets Carolina. They concede a lot of points, mainly in touchdowns. So you ideally don't want to start your wide receivers against Carolina, but Mike Evans is such a scoring machine that I feel like the touchdown upside is huge, and that's why I do want to start him in this situation. Don't start slot guys against Carolina, though. They're very good against the slot. George Pickens takes on Cincy. It's not the greatest matchup, but it's a good one. It's better for tight ends, but it is a good matchup for Pickens. I do think he's a top 10 player this week and will be a lot of times this season. This sort of situation where he can definitely score and make some big plays, but he's got a lower floor than most of the guys above him. He and Evans have a kind of a lower floor, and it's these next few guys that kind of fit in that similar range, but their ceiling's not quite as high. Cortland Sutton's been on an absolute tear. Who saw this coming when he put down a donut in week 7 or something like that? Now, to be fair, I did think he was going to have big games in week 8 and week 9. You can check the receipts on that, but I did not see it continuing into these tough matchups. He gets a good matchup this week against the Browns. They've conceded the 5th most points to wide receivers this season, and they particularly concede points to outside wide receivers. So I do think Sutton could have another good game. He slides in ahead of Higgins, who has the same argument as Chase. It's probably going to be a high-scoring game, but it is a tough matchup. Drake London's been very inconsistent. The Chargers secondary is solid, so I do think he's going to find that a little bit tough, but they're probably going to have to pass the ball because it's so hard to run on the Chargers. We've seen Neighbors and Hill already, but we haven't seen either of the Jets guys. We haven't seen them do much the last few weeks. Wilson's still higher than Adams for me, slightly more talented. He is the better player at this stage of his career, but either of those guys could go off. Maybe they both do, or maybe neither does. It's a total lottery game. Lab McConkey, very good PPR option, gets a good matchup against the Falcons, but he has limited scoring upside. They don't really use him a lot in the red zone. They tend to look for Johnston and Disley and their bigger guys. Going to be harder for them to run it in, so I do feel like he's got more touchdown upside than usual, but I don't think he's had a red zone touchdown since like week 1. He might have had one in that 2 touchdown game, but for the most part, they just don't use him in the red zone at all. Calvin Ridley, slightly tough matchup against the Commanders. Their secondary's improved a lot. Crazy that they traded away their first-round cornerback, Emmanuel Forbes. They picked him like 16th overall. And it was a bit of a reach then, even though he always had upside. But not even letting him see the end of his rookie contract is saying something. But they've strengthened that a lot. So their secondary is a lot better. I do think Ridley's going to have a slightly tougher game, but he's still a solid start as a wide receiver too. DK and Jackson Smith-Njigba, another pair of teammates that are back-to-back in the same game, this time on the other side of the ball. It is hard to pass on the Jets. The Jets have conceded the 3rd fewest points to wide receivers so far this season. So I do think it's kind of hard to trust either of them, but the upside's so big. JSN's been on a bit of a tear, and DK Metcalf is still an elite player. Terry McLaurin's been very up and down, has 100-yard games and then has under 20-yard games. Who knows what he's going to do against Tennessee? You'd expect it to be a bad game, considering they've conceded the 4th fewest points to wide receivers. But he's done it against good teams and he's done it against bad teams. He's really, really inconsistent. You just don't know what you're going to get from Scary Terry. So I can't have him lower than this because the upside's big, but I can't have him higher because the floor's so low. So he ends up here. Zay Flowers has been disappointing of late, but against Philly, I feel like they might need to pass a little bit. It's very hard to run on Philly. It's not easy to pass them either, but if you're going to go somewhere, you generally go to the wide receivers. Not as so much as in previous years, but they can still be attacked out wide. So I think Flowers has a chance there. Brian Thomas Jr., I expect a big bounce back. He's been battling injuries. He hasn't had Trevor Lawrence the last couple of weeks, and he's looked bad. He gets a great matchup against the Texans. Frankly, I want to have him higher. I would love to have him higher, and I tossed up putting him as high as 20, but ultimately there's just still a lot of risk there. So I've got him there, but I do think the upside is huge. He fits perfectly into that Jaden Reed, DJ Moore situation of having high upside, but a very low floor. Same thing with Khalil Shakir in that snow game. Because he's the slot guy, he is closer to the line of scrimmage, and therefore we might see a lot of touches for him, given that it's kind of hard to pass downfield in the snow. We just don't know exactly what that game's going to look like, though. If the snow clears a little bit and it's just pure snow with no rain and it's not too icy, we could even just see a normal passing game. But I do think if it's a proper snow game, we could see more checkdowns than usual, or we just see a whole lot of running and you hardly see Shakir at all. That makes him very, very hard to trust. But in PPR, he at least has a bit of a flaw. I wanted to have Marvin Harrison Jr. higher against the Vikings, but they were so bad last week, and I think there's just a bit more upside with Thomas and Shakir. If we do see some snow, obviously, I will move Harrison up past Shakir. Tank Dell, very hard to trust with Nico Collins back. Gets a fantastic matchup, which is why he's this high, but he's a very much a boom-bust option at this stage. You're going to see a lot more looks, and he's got to do a lot with each of those looks to pay off. Obviously, we saw Keenan Allen pay off. Surprisingly enough, he's really bounced back, but he was always going to be solid with the best slot matchup in football. Juwan Jennings and Deebo Samuel, way lower than you usually get them. It's a snow game. It's against a really good Bills secondary. It is very hard to pass on the Bills. You generally can run on them, though. Teams generally have to pass on them because the Bills are usually ahead, which is why they concede more points than usual. But in this case, while it's in the snow, while both teams are going to struggle to pass, I do think we'll see a whole lot more CMC and Kittle than we see Deebo and Juwan Jennings in particular. Deebo might get used in the run game maybe a little bit, but they've already got Jordan Mason for that. So I'm sure they'll scheme up some ways to get these guys the ball, but I do think we'll see quieter games from both of them, as we've seen from Deebo the last few weeks. Darnell Mooney has really dropped down a little bit. He's been battling injury a little bit, gets a tough matchup against the Chargers too. He's hard to trust, but he is ultimately still the wide receiver, 13 or something on the season. Michael Pittman has improved, and he has Josh Downs out, which should help him. But against the Patriots, that doesn't mean anything in particular. The Patriots will generally shut down some part of the game. I think probably they'll try to shut down Jonathan Taylor, but it is possible they shut down Pittman, and that could really hurt him. Jordan Addison's had some boom weeks, but realistically against the Cardinals, very hard to trust. Jerry Jeudy and all of the Browns realistically are hard to trust. Judy's my favorite of the two options. He and Elijah Moore. Cedric Tillman's out, of course. I'm not interested in any of the other guys below them. We did see Xavier Legette have some inconsistent production, and David Moore was the guy that got a lot of touches last week, despite them switching the Z and X roles. I do think that Legette is someone who's always got upside in any given week because he's used so much in the red zone. He's not actually big-bodied, but he plays big, and that really helps him in the red zone. So he's up there along with Quentin Johnston because of that upside. Amari Cooper might drop even further depending on what's happening in that snow game. We've talked about that heap already. We also just haven't seen him play full snaps yet. Until he is, he's going to be lower down. It's really disappointing. Love Amari Cooper. Got a lot of shares of him. It's just impossible to trust. Xavier Worthy, obviously already played. Same thing with a lot of those guys higher up. Demario Douglas, more of a PPR guy, but still got a solid floor. So if you need a floor option, he's there. Noah Brown, similar idea, just get some consistent touches without anything special. And Marquez Valdez-Scantling, the opposite of a floor option. He has zero floor, but he'll get 3 or 4 long shots at him. And if he takes one to the house, all of a sudden you've got 15 points from him. That's just how it goes. He rips off 70, 80-yard touchdowns like there's no tomorrow. Will it happen this week? Probably not. But against the Rams, it might. Finally, the tight ends, Travis Kelce and Brock Bowers have already played. Bowers was the guy to own there, of course. Trey McBride, big game last week, but really lacks touchdown upside. Very good in PPR, half PPR, drops back a little bit, but Taysom Hill's kind of the total opposite. Very, very risky, but you've always got touchdown upside. They use him a lot in the red zone. I do think that he could have another solid game, but that upside is why I've got him so high. If you're looking for floor, though, go for a TJ Hawkinson against Arizona. That's a solid matchup. George Kittle in the snow against Buffalo is scary. That's why I've got him down at 6. But it is possible he'll have a big game because they might need to check down because of the snow situation, and Purdy's not fully healthy. That's why he wasn't high up in my rankings. Kate Otten jumps back up again. Against Carolina, they have conceded the most points to tight ends so far this season. That's why Otten's up so high. He jumps over David Njoku, who I previously had a little bit higher. He's slightly higher in PPR. Janu Smith, we already saw. Evan Ingram, slightly lower down than you'd hope. It is hard to go to tight ends against the Texans. They tend to cover the middle of the field very nicely. So Ingram's a little bit lower than usual, and he has low touchdown upside. In fact, I might even move Dallas Goedert over him, depending on what happens with Devonta Smith. I think Smith's probably out, and if that happens, I can imagine Goedert moving up to 10 at least, maybe even higher. Hunter Henry, a solid option any given week. Same with Will Disley. Obviously, Sam Laporta had, 6 yards and 2 touchdowns or something insane. He's very boom bust. So these guys are kind of the opposite of that. So if you went the safe route, you probably end up with a Henry or a Disley or maybe an Ertz. Good PPR options, okay, half PPR options as those kind of like streaming tight ends if you haven't managed to hit on your starter all season. Finally, Mark Andrews against the Eagles. Both of the Ravens tight ends tend to get used a little bit more when the Ravens are trailing. I do think they are favorites according to Vegas in this game. In fact, if I look it up, they are indeed 2.5-point favorites in what should be a high-scoring game. But in that sort of close game, we do see the tight ends get passed to a little bit more. Likely coming back does hurt Andrews a little bit, but he is still the top pass receiving option. No one else there particularly excites me. And that's all we've got for week 13. Should be some really good games this Sunday. If you've got any questions, of course, leave them in the comments, or if you want a quick answer, hit me up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. You can also check out my stuff over at Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. My articles are at football.raspball.com. And of course, you can find my rankings at ffdfantasyfootball.com. I do keep those updated regularly, and we'll even have them updated within 30 minutes of the game. So if you want to make a last minute decision, check out the website. I always do a last minute update in the last 15 or 30 minutes to make sure I've got all of the outs sorted. You could also like and subscribe on YouTube, not because you need to, but because you like the content and you want to support us. That would be much appreciated. I look forward to seeing you guys when we get another Bipocalypse next week. We'll have a waiver wire show on Tuesday, and that's going to be a very important one as we move towards the playoffs. Start talking about stashes for the playoffs as well on Thursday in our Streamers and Stasher show. And finally, of course, we'll be starting and sitting again, probably a little bit earlier next week. I had a big weekend, so it's delayed a bit this week. But normally, we'll go a little bit earlier with our Start Sit show next week as well. Plus, I'll be on the Raspball YouTube channel again next week, as I am most weeks. I look forward to seeing you guys next time on the Fantasy First Down.